Hey, welcome back to another episode of Parker's Pensées. I'm your host, Parker Case, and this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. I love thinking about cool stuff, so come think with me. For those who are familiar with the show, here is Theophilus. He just decided to be insane, of course, because we just pushed record, so that means he's going to be nuts. Hopefully, he will not be eating into my books, but this is a podcast where we explore all the deepest ideas in philosophy, theology, nature, and life. Man, I love thinking about cool stuff. So you guys are invited to come think with me. Today's a very special guest. I have with me Dr. Samuel Lebens, and man, we're going to be talking about whether or not you exist in the mind of God and whether or not you're like a fictional character in his mind. It's going to be awesome. I'm really, really excited for it. If you guys like this podcast, please consider becoming a Patreon patron. Or if you're watching on YouTube, you can become a YouTube member. And YouTube members and patrons get early access to all the episodes, as well as a bunch of other perks and merch and stuff like that. So you can find the links in the description. If you're on YouTube, you can see the join thing. Just go ahead and give that a click. A lot of ways to support the podcast. So please consider doing so if you want me to keep feeding my crazy dog and keep these lights on. So without further ado, let's bring in Sam and let's talk about God's mind. Sam, thanks so
Hi.
much for coming on the podcast, man. This is really exciting.
Great pleasure. It's nice to be here. How you doing?
Doing well. Now that I got you here, how well? So you're in a different place in the world. Can you tell us
Man,
a little bit about where you're at and what you're doing out there?
sure. So I'm a professor of philosophy at the University of Haifa in the north of Israel. I was born and raised in England, but it was always an ambition of mine and my family's, my ancestors, of course, to come back to Israel from where we hailed. It was a long time in exile. Um, so luckily, I managed to get a job in the University of Haifa. I'd spent some time in America before that. I was at Rutgers
Hmm.
in the Center for Philosophy of Religion there, and I was at Notre Dame at the Center for Philosophy of Religion there. But I grew up in England. I'm from the town of Leicester. For those of your listeners or viewers who follow soccer, as they call it, on your side of the Atlantic,
That's right.
we call it football. That's it. So in the north of Israel is where I
Awesome.
make my home.
Yeah, I'm glad you mentioned Lester because I was gonna ask about your accent. I'm
Yeah,
trying to get like good at picking out because I get all these English guests on,
yeah,
and you all sound different. Everyone sounds
yeah.
different. Yours is like an elegant. You got a real nice one there.
Oh,
Is
thank
is
you,
that?
Parker.
I don't
Yeah,
know where it is. Is that northern England or like what?
Leicester is right in the middle of England,
Okay,
so it's I think some people in Leicester do have a northern accent, but mine is quite generic. My
okay,
English accent, but it's crazy. It's a tiny country, England, and yet the number of accents in that
yeah,
country and in the United Kingdom in general is very small. It's like United Kingdom is much smaller than Texas, let's say,
right.
and it's got you know dozens, if not hundreds, of accents. Crazy.
Seriously, yeah, so crazy. Well, before we jump in on some of your papers here, I just wanted to get a feel for like how'd you get into philosophy, and then what
Sure.
made you want to become a professional philosopher?
Sure. Well, I I got into philosophy at high school.
Hmm.
Um, I I when I was 16 in British high school, you have to specialize in a few topics. It's like taking APs, advanced papers,
Yeah.
in America, but that's all you do in high school for the last 2 years in Britain, and you
Wow.
have to choose a number of topics. And in fact, that's why like things like law and medicine in America are postgrad degrees. In Britain, they're undergraduate degrees, and
Hmm.
you have to choose at high school already, like to do pre med at high school. That's
Big
crazy.
decision. Yeah,
It's
seriously,
massive
big decision.
decisions. I had no clue what I wanted to do. So I chose things I thought I was good at. I chose theatre, English literature, and politics. And I needed a fourth, and I wanted to do music, but my parents said, you can't do drama and music. You need to do like, they wanted more academic.
Yeah.
So one of the teachers from the religious studies department at high school pulled me aside and was like, Sam, you've got to take our A level in philosophy. It's amazing. And I really didn't enjoy religious studies at high school. And I was like, no, I don't want to do it. But he practically begged me. He said, you're really going to like this. I promise you. So I decided to take it just to see what it was like. And it really changed my life. I actually, I recently wrote an introduction to philosophy of religion. It's
Hmm.
called Philosophy of Religion: The Basics. It's part of a series with Routledge, and I dedicated it to my two philosophy A-level teachers. Like I
Wow.
said, I didn't, And then you said, how do I become a professional philosopher? Well, um, I did. I did my bachelor's degree, um, and I just felt like I hadn't exhausted the itch that I was trying to scratch with my with my philosophy degree.
Yeah.
I'll do a master's, and then I, you know, finished the PhD, the master's PhD, and I just wasn't finished, scratching that itch. And
Yeah.
there wasn't a moment where I said, okay, I'm going to become a professional philosopher. It just um, I just never gave up studying it. And there was rabbinic stuff on the side as well. I went to rabbinical school as well.
Yeah.
So I did. I became religious as about the same time as I found philosophy, actually, but
Oh,
it wasn't
fascinating.
it wasn't as related in my life as it became.
Yeah.
The religion stuff was more based on emotions, whereas the philosophy was more based on reason, and it took
Nice.
a while for me to kind of marry the two.
Yeah.
Um, one second, there's a noise in the background.
Yeah.
Can you hear that? Is that okay?
Just a little bit. It's totally fine. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
So I what was I saying? Yeah. So
Well,
so
yeah, religious.
yeah. So I became religious about the same time, and I actually before I did my bachelor's degree, I did 2 years in rabbinical school.
Hmm.
And actually, at the rabbinical school, and I'm sure it's the same in some Christian circles, they were not keen on me doing philosophy. They thought like, oh, you'll go to university, you'll study philosophy, you'll lose your faith.
100%.
Didn't happen to me, thank God.
Yeah.
And then after my PhD, I went back to rabbinical school, and I actually became an ordained rabbi.
Yeah.
Um,
And
yeah,
is
so
that Orthodox? You're an Orthodox
yeah,
rabbi, right?
I'm an
Okay.
Orthodox rabbi. Yeah,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, I'm a very unorthodox Orthodox rabbi, but officially, I'm an Orthodox rabbi.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah. I've been enjoying some of your works on that. You wrote a piece like critiquing Ben Shapiro. I thought
yeah,
that was a good
yeah.
one.
That's right.
It's
That's right.
fun stuff. Um,
Yeah.
so today we're going to get into Hasidic idealism, and
Hmm.
looking over even like the sources and stuff like that. I'm like, usually I have a way in, and I can, oh, I know this author, and this one was like, nope, I don't know. So I need a lot of help. And it was really good. Hasidic, can you help us with like the difference between like Hasidic and Orthodox? Is there a difference
Sure.
between those types of Judaism?
Yeah, yes and no. Orthodoxy is like a broad description of lots of different strands, lots of different types of orthodoxy. I
Mm.
suppose it's like, you could call yourself Protestant, but then there's loads of different strands of
Right.
Protestantism.
Yeah.
Even within like a more united church, like the Catholic Church, you could call yourself Catholic, but then even within Catholic, there are different
Yeah.
sects or different,
Augustinian and yeah.
Augustinian, yeah, and then
Yeah.
you could be in different, if you're different orders, right? Monastic
Yep.
orders,
Hmm.
could be Dominican and Franciscan or whatever. So,
Yeah.
I would say that the orthodoxy is like one very broad communion. I'm trying to translate into kind of Christian
This
terms,
is good. This is
well,
helpful.
right? And then
Yeah.
there are lots of different strands within that very broad communion. One strand is ultra orthodoxy, which takes a very negative attitude towards non-Jewish wisdom, the secular world. They're quite introverted, a bit like the Amish,
Okay.
okay, that's the ultra
This is
orthodox.
good. I'm
Um,
so glad you can help with all the connections, man. This is
it's
gold. Yeah.
and then
Yeah.
because I spent quite a lot of time with a lot of Christian theologians and philosophers, so I've kind
Yeah.
of learned. Um, Hasidism was a pietistic movement in the 1700s within Orthodoxy.
Okay.
Um, and now the intellectual descendants of Hasidism are one strand of ultra Orthodoxy
Hmm.
today. Now, I'm not a Hasidic Jew and I'm not an ultra Orthodox Jew. I'm what's called a modern Orthodox Jew, which is a type of Orthodoxy that embraces secular wisdom,
Okay.
not and non-Jewish wisdom, as well as Torah wisdom and revealed wisdom. But I have never believed that Hasidic wisdom is only for members of the Hasidic sects, right?
Yeah.
There's a
Yeah.
lot of wisdom there, for all of us, Jew and non-Jew, to
Yeah.
reflect. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay, that's fantastic. So another one would be I already lost it. You told me how to say it, but I think it's Kabbalistic
Yeah,
Judaism.
Kabbalah, right? So there's
Yeah.
Kabbalistic Judaism, right? So Kabbalah is the main strand of Jewish mystical thinking, and there are Kabbalistic Jews. Hasidism was pretty much exclusively Kabbalistic, but
Okay.
but there were non-Hasidic Jews who were Kabbalists as well. Hasidism tended to be an Eastern European phenomenon,
Ah,
whereas the Kabbalah was much wider. Geographically, Jews in North Africa, Jews in the lands associated with Islam, as well as Jews in Europe,
okay.
were interested in the Kabbalah.
Was the Kabbalah and Kabbalistic Judaism was that more like mystical, and then Hasidic was more like intellectual? Is that a way to categorize them, or not necessarily?
No, no, I wouldn't say that. I'd say
Okay.
that Kabbalah is Jewish mysticism. So all Kabbalists are mystical. There were non-Kabbalistic Jews like Maimonides, the Jewish
Yeah.
rationalists,
Yeah.
and there you could make that distinction.
Okay.
But also, Hasidism was anti-elitist. So you're right that Hasidism was emotional, pietistic, but non-elitist. It was supposed to be
Gotcha.
for the everyday Jew, whereas non-Hasidic forms of Judaism, be they Kabbalistic or not Kabbalistic, they'd become quite elitist and quite intellectualist.
Yeah.
And if you weren't smart enough, you kind of didn't matter.
Yeah.
God forbid.
Yeah.
Whereas as Hasidism was about rejecting that elitism.
Okay.
Everybody can have a relationship with God. You don't have to be smart.
Yeah.
Yeah,
Oh man, this is good. And there's a lot. Yeah, there's a lot of overlap in Christendom as well
sure,
with those type of
sure,
things. Man, that's
exactly.
fascinating.
Yeah,
So you got this paper that we're going to be talking about where you're trying to help solve this problem of oh man of Sephra and Sephrat.
the
Is
Sefirot. Yeah, the
oh man,
Sefirot
okay,
is the plural.
Sephirat. Yeah.
Yeah,
Um,
yeah, yeah.
so you're
You're doing
solving this
great, Bob.
problem. Thanks, man. I appreciate it. This is like way out of my element, but I'm loving it. There's this apparent problem where it looks like um well, it looks like there's different, like, aspects of God,
Yeah,
in one way, or maybe even, like, different personalities almost, like, different
that's
things in
right.
God are personified, like His justice and
Yeah,
stuff. Can you
yeah,
help us, like can you lay out,
yeah.
Sephirat more and
Sefirot. Yeah.
yeah, motivate the problem
So
for us?
no worries. Sefirot is the plural of the word Sefirah. So there are 10 of these things. Each one of them is a Sefirah, and in plural they're the Sefirot. What are they? Well, it's part of the Kabbalistic tradition, and non-Kabbalistic Jews don't believe in this at all. They don't think there
Okay.
is such a thing as the Sefirot. There's just God. The Kabbalistic Jews, be they Hasidic or non-Hasidic, doesn't matter. Kabbalistic Jews have tended to relate to God as this singular being who, in his transcendence, so to speak, before he even created the world, he was completely unified and undifferentiated, almost to such an extent that language fails systematically to describe this being, God in his transcendence, because the way that language seems to work, it has this deep grammar, predicates and subjects. Every sentence kind of has the noun phrase, which is what the sentence is about, and then the predicate, which describes the noun phrase. And the idea is that God in his transcendent is so unified and also so kind of self-sufficient,
Yeah.
and there's such an undifferentiated perfection that as soon as you try to describe God, you start imposing um, distinctions where there really shouldn't be distinctions, even if it's just distinctions of grammar. So the idea is God in his transcendence, completely and utterly singular. But as God becomes manifest in the world that he creates, it's as if the pure light of God's divinity, and I know this Gregory Palamas, is that his name in the Eastern tradition,
I'm
that
not sure.
in Eastern Christian Orthodoxy. I think there's a similar thought in Eastern Orthodoxy in Christendom. There's this idea that God's light, as it comes into the world, is kind of refracted
Yeah.
into different, like the white light of the sun becomes refracted into the many colors of the rainbow,
Yeah.
right? God, as he so to speak, unfolds into his own creation, he refracts into these 10 kind of attributes,
Hmm.
and that's what we call the Sefirot, these 10 attributes. Now, um, the problem is in the mystical tradition, you asked me what the problem is.
Yeah.
Um, the mystical tradition relates to these 10 attributes, which it sees sourced in the hinted to in the Hebrew Bible. The Hebrew Bible never, as you'll know, because it's the Old Testament of your
Yeah.
Bible, Parker,
Right.
but it never refers to these things by name as there being 10 of these things, although there's an odd verse here or there that the Kabbalists appropriate or recruit as hinting to these ten attributes. But as the Kabbalistic tradition develops, they start to relate to them as powers, like 10
Mm.
powers.
Yeah.
They even start to relate to them as interacting with one another. So one of them is called mercy, right? And one of them is called justice. And those two are in tension with one another. And you can kind of imagine, like God, uh, from the aspect of justice, God forbid, might want to punish us for our sins, but from the aspect of mercy, might want to forgive us.
Yeah.
Um, and as this unfolds into the world, these two, so to speak, entities, justice and mercy, are in conflict with one another. And some
Yeah.
of them are male and some of them are female. Some of them even have erotic relations and give birth to, to new Sefirot.
Mm.
So along came the anti-Kabbalistic Jews, and they said, "Where are you getting this from?" First of all, it's not in the Bible, right? It's
Right.
just not in the Bible. It's not even in the early rabbinic traditions, or if it is, it's deeply hidden, right? The
Yeah.
Kabbalistic masters, they could find hints in earlier rabbinic texts, but it's certainly not explicit in the Bible. So first of all, where are you getting this from? Second of all, we are monotheists, right? And we
Yep.
believe that God is one. And you've kind of made him like he's 10. And they'd say all these strange things. Well, that God is 10, but he's also one, right?
Mm.
And they're like, are these things identical to each other? Because if they're one, they must be identical to each other. Or are they distinct entities? Because if they're fighting or making love, right,
Yeah.
then they
Right.
must be they must be distinct entities. But if they're all God, they must be identical entities. If you pray to them, is that idolatry because you're not
Mm.
actually praying to God? I know that in some parts of Christendom, praying to saints or praying to people other than God is acceptable, and in other parts of Christendom, that's completely forbidden. But
Yep.
the, in the Jewish tradition, it's almost exclusive. You can't pray to anything other than God, and yet
Hmm.
in the mystics seem to pray to these things. Well, so you can start to see the problems, and I think for a Christian, it's not identical for reasons we might get to, Parker, but it's very similar to problems related to the Trinity,
Yeah.
right? Because along comes the early church based on hints perhaps in the New Testament. Some people may think it's more than hints, other people may think it's just hints, but based on
Yeah.
hints in the New Testament that you'd find much harder to justify in the Old Testament. But again, maybe you could see hints here and there. But
Yeah.
but along comes the early church and says, look, God is three persons. It's one God, three persons. And the Unitarians, and I don't mean the Unitarian Universal Church in America that's barely theistic. I mean the hardcore Unitarians, like
Yeah.
the
Right.
real,
They
Muslim
usually call
Christian,
themselves biblical. We're biblical
yeah,
Unitarians. You're like, all right, we're all
biblical
trying to be
Unitarians.
biblical, but yeah, that's fine. Go ahead.
Yeah, but
Yeah.
people like Dale Tuggy, right? Yeah, I don't know if
Yeah.
you've come
Sure.
across Dale's work,
Yeah. Of
but
course.
but
Of
also
course.
also Muslims and Jews, outside of the Kabbalistic tradition, were Unitarians. God is one, and what are you telling me that three persons they're identical to each other, but they're not identical to each other, but they're one, but they're three? It just sounds like a complete headache, and
Hmm.
the anti-Kabbalistic Jews said similar things against the Kabbalah because of this, what I'm calling the problem with the Sefirot. And
Yeah.
to such an extent that in one famous medieval letter, an anti-Kabbalistic rabbi, Rabbi Shimon Juran, says, you think Christianity has trouble, but they've only got three. You guys
Yeah.
have got 10. So,
Yep.
so I'm certainly not the first to draw this analogy between the problem of the Sefirot and related problems with Trinitarian thinking.
Yeah, I love that. As I saw it, I was like, okay, boom, yes, we got the same kind
Okay,
of thing
got it.
going on here. This is so good. Um, so if a lot of my audience will know that, like, if you read a book on divine simplicity, it
Hmm.
has to have the prism on the cover. It has to, the white light coming
Yes,
in, and
yes,
but
yes,
usually they will emphasize, these are not real distinctions. It's just through the
yeah,
prism of creation type stuff.
yeah,
With with Kabbalism, are
yeah.
they? Is it clear whether there's like a general teaching, like these are distinct things, or is there even infighting within and it's just kind of
Look, it's
all
not
over?
it's not clear. There's a lot of
Yeah,
infighting and there's a lot of confusion. I
sure,
just have to be completely brutally honest with you.
sure,
The early sources seem to mix their metaphors all the time. So
okay,
sometimes they make it sound like these 10 Sefirot are instruments that God uses, and sometimes they're described as attributes of God. Sometimes they're described as like independent entities. Sometimes they're described merely as refracted light. And
yeah,
some of these mystical authors, mix those metaphors and use them all. And you're like, oh no, I'm trying to get my head straight. It's a philosopher. It's a real pain. And one thing that differentiates Jewish orthodoxy, I think, from any kind of Christian denomination is that we never had councils, right?
mm,
So in Christian theology, there are going to be these early councils, church councils. Different churches, of course, will disagree as to which ones are authoritative and which ones do you have to listen to and which ones
right,
but we never had anything of the sort. So really what unifies our communion, so to speak, is practical. We all see ourselves bound by Jewish law, and there's a
yeah,
very intricate Jewish legal system. But on matters of fine grained theology, we never had a council to say, okay, now we're going to decide these guys are
yeah,
right, those guys are wrong. And so our traditions just got like lots of different suggestions,
yeah,
right? And
yeah.
I'm just a lonely guy trying to make sense of them all.
Well, I kind of like that, because it's like, we disagree on some stuff, but I am
Yeah,
not going to call you a heretic, like, or maybe you could joke with each other
yeah,
a little bit more
yeah,
than
yeah.
like,
That's
no, this council said that. And like, well, what if we come to learn something different than what the council said? What if our metaphysics are different? It's like, nope,
yeah.
it's got to be Aristotelian. It's got to, yeah.
That's
So
right. That's right. We do
that's
we
fascinating.
do have more freedom and
Yeah,
a certain degree more tolerance. Don't get me wrong. There have been
yeah,
terrible times where Jews have written other Jews off for being heretics and burnt their books.
sure,
But in theory, and you do see it even in practice, Jews with very different theologies will go to the same synagogue and pray together.
yeah, yeah. So I had a question about the Sefirot.
Yeah.
Can you say it again for me? I want to try and say it
So
right.
so we'll talk about them in the plural. So it's the Sefirot.
Sephirat. Okay, boom.
Yeah.
Sephirat.
Good.
Um, so like, if you read a commentary on like the book of John, the Gospel of John,
Yeah. Yeah.
um, D.A. Carson, one of my professors, he would emphasize Debar in the Old Testament, and God spoke by His
Mm,
word, and
word.
it's almost as if the word is being personified, and that was
Right.
kind of my hook to get into the Sephirat and be like, oh, I'm
Good.
seeing some of this, but can you tell us some more? Like, you don't have to
Yeah.
name all
So
10,
look,
but is the word one of them, or not really?
that's a very nice point, Parker. No, well, maybe the word is one of them. There are three intellectual sefirot, right?
Okay.
Most of them are more like emotional. Three of them are kind of intellectual: chokhmah, bina, and dat, wisdom, understanding, and knowledge.
Oh, cool.
Um, and there
Yeah.
are some people who identify chokhmah, which is wisdom, with Torah, with scripture, the Old
Yep.
Testament, and they
Mhm.
associate that with the word, right? So
Yeah.
what's happening in John is there's a reference there to the wisdom in the book of Proverbs, chapter 8,
Yep.
right? There was the wisdom that existed before the world was created, right?
Mhm.
So yes, in the Kabbalistic system, many people would identify the first of the Sefirot, called Chokhmah, with that wisdom that existed before the world was created, and that's likely what John was talking about.
Yeah.
Now,
Yeah.
in the Christian tradition, that becomes flesh in Jesus.
Yeah.
In the Jewish tradition, that becomes, so to speak, flesh in the scripture
Mm.
of the five books of Moses.
Yeah.
Right, the five
Okay.
books of Moses is something like an incarnation of
Yeah.
that first Sephirah. And in fact,
Okay.
I mean, I'm not here to teach you Christianity, but in fact, that's one way of understanding what Jesus is saying. He's saying when that he comes to embody the law of Moses, he's
Hmm.
being quite literal, right? That the law of Moses was the first incarnation of that davar, of that word,
Yeah.
but perhaps it was unduly abstract and the people didn't understand what they were supposed to understand from it. So it becomes incarnate in actual flesh in Jesus. Now, I'm not a
Yeah. Through his
Christian.
teaching.
I'm not. I'm
Yeah.
not a I'm not a messianic Jew either. So
Yeah.
these are not my theologies. But
Right.
But it helps you to understand where I'm coming from.
Yeah. One of the really nice things about having you on is hearing you pronounce the words. So like, I love wisdom, knowledge, understanding. I read Proverbs every day. I'm trying to be a sage, trying to be a philosopher
Yeah.
sage, right? But
Yeah.
in my head it's Hokmah. So it's so good to hear you with
Chokhmah.
not my Chicago accent saying it. Can you pronounce it for us again?
Chokhmah.
Hokmah. It's so good.
Good. Very good.
Okay,
Yeah.
yeah, this is fantastic. So,
Yeah. So that
um,
would be the first of the Sefirot. And we actually
yeah,
see in the Kabbalistic tradition the main protagonists in the Hebrew Bible are all embodiments of different, they are all incarnations of different Sefirot. So Abraham is an incarnation of loving kindness,
huh.
and Isaac is is an incarnation of restraint.
Mm,
Jacob, interestingly, is an incarnation of truth, even though he seems like an
huh.
absolute liar, right?
Yeah, totally.
But there's a whole. It's a very very intricate system, and in fact, there were Christian Kabbalists in the medieval period who kind of uh, played around with some of this stuff too.
Yeah. Yeah, this is so good. Yeah, okay. So try not to get lost here. So there's some options for thinking about Sfirat.
Yeah,
One is that they're descriptions of one God. Another is that
yeah,
they're 10 names.
yeah,
And then another would be like they're emanations, which
yeah,
emanate from God. And I would
yeah,
imagine that the emanation view might have more to do, or might be influenced by like Neoplatonism, but
yes,
perhaps not.
absolutely.
Okay.
No, no, no. You're absolutely right. You're absolutely right.
Okay.
And Neoplatonism was a big influence over Jewish mysticism, just as it was over Christian and Muslim
Okay.
mysticism in the Middle Ages. Um, and I actually think the emanations view is probably the most widespread.
Okay.
That these 10
Okay.
things like emanations of one God.
Yeah.
Yeah,
One of the something that I've noticed in even in like the continental versus analytic debate, I would say the continentals are more the mystic like type brain folks, and
yes,
and even in Christian mysticism as well. When you try to
yes,
get clear on some of this stuff, part of the impetus for it is that it's unclear, and that's
yeah,
part of the like the like, hey, look, you're trying to get us to talk about this transcendent thing and I
yeah,
can't do that. So yeah,
yeah,
of course we'd expect. And it's like you try to pin down. Well, what do you mean emanations? Is it? Well,
yeah,
look, man, it's emanations, and I wonder,
yeah,
does
yeah.
that play a part in Jewish mysticism as well?
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. And what I'm doing, and a small number of colleagues, is quite rare in that we're trying to use the tools of analytic philosophy
Hmm.
to discuss not Jewish philosophy in general, which we do, but even to attack, so to speak, Jewish mysticism and say, okay, yeah, I know you guys are talking about things which are, in essence, difficult to talk about or whatever, and you also place a lot of weight not just on thought but on emotion and an experience, and that's great, and we're not criticizing that, but
Yeah,
how much clarity can we bring to the ways you talk and to in the mystic tradition,
right.
and that's almost like a challenge I set myself, right? how
Yeah,
how much clarity can we bring to bear on these mystical traditions?
yeah, that's so good. So there's these three options, and then you come up with this fourth option, the
Yeah,
Hasidic solution. But so I'm gonna
yeah.
just go over really quick. Why do the first three? Why are they no good?
Well, um, so basically, if they are descriptions, if they're just 10 descriptions of God, then you have to lose a lot of what seems to be essential to the mystical tradition, because we
Yeah,
talk about these things um, conflicting with one another, making love with one another, having relationships with one another.
yeah,
Well, I'm sure, Parker, there are more than 10 true descriptions of you, right?
yeah,
We could come up with a whole list of true descriptions of you, but it would be really bizarre to talk about the descriptions fighting one another or making love with one another or producing things, in anything but a deeply metaphorical sense.
Right.
So it just
Right.
seems like description seems like the wrong way to go. Um, also, God is described quite explicitly in the Bible. I'm thinking of Exodus 32 and 33, where Moses is on Mount Sinai and he asks God for something like, "Let me see your glory," and God, so to
Yeah.
speak, describes himself to Moses at that stage. Now, there's a deep dogma in Judaism that Moses is the greatest prophet who ever lived.
Hmm.
And the idea that the Kabbalists could come up with 10 descriptions that beat the descriptions
Oh,
that Moses came up with,
wow.
no, we can't accept that, right? So that's
Sure.
kind of an intra-religious kind of sentiment as to why it would be problematic to say descriptions. What exactly the difference between descriptions and names is, okay, but likewise with emanations, emanations comes closest to the view that I'm actually going to defend. Right, I think the
Okay.
Hasidic view that I defend is almost like an unpacking of what we might mean by emanations, but until you unpack it, that the there's a difficulty in terms of the way that the Hasidim and the mystics talk about them being 10 but also one.
Hmm.
Think of like the three persons being three but also one.
Yeah.
Um, if they're emanations, well, then there are 10 of them, and they're not one at all. They're kind of emanations of the same thing, but the underlying, red and yellow are both refractions, I suppose, if that's the right word, of white light. But red
Hmm.
is not identical to yellow.
Right.
They are different wavelengths.
Yeah.
They're both there, perhaps, in the white, but they're not identical.
Yeah.
And if you want to say that these 10 things are, I wanted to provide a model that could really make sense of saying they're one and they're 10.
Yeah.
Without contradicting, and I think just saying they're emanations doesn't do that. It's a
Yeah.
little bit like you said, Parker. It's like in the mystical tradition, sometimes they'll give you a word like emanations, and you think you know what that word means, but like you haven't really been given a theory. So
Yeah.
just to say that they're emanations isn't enough. I think this is a little bit similar to what I believe in most Christian churches is thought of as a heresy, but the heresy of modalism in the Trinity,
Hmm.
which is that there's one God and there's three different ways that he appears.
Yeah.
And the problem with modalism is that it doesn't give those three ways, first of all, enough ontological clout. They're merely ways that God appears.
Yeah.
And another problem, I think, with modalism for Trinitarians, but correct me if I'm wrong, is that it doesn't do justice to the sense in which God is all three of them.
Hmm.
These are just masks that he wears.
Right.
It doesn't really do justice to the the, the unity between God and any given one of them. They're
Yeah.
just masks.
Yeah.
So for similar reasons why the Christian might reject modalism, I'm not happy with just saying they're emanations.
Yeah.
It just doesn't seem to me to do justice to the Kabbalistic tradition that I'm trying to make sense of, a
Yeah.
tradition in which these 10 things are one, they interact with one another, etc., etc.
Yeah, and that's really helpful. And I thought this was also fascinating for my Trinitarian listeners who emphasize the unity and diversity of Trinitarian doctrine and want to say like, hey, look, we have this problem in philosophy of the one and the many, and is everything
Mm-hmm.
one? Is everything many? Well, kind of both. Well, yeah, that makes sense if the world's been made by a God who is both one and three, and I thought there's a nice little parody here of, well, here's a God who is one and 10. And
Yeah,
so, it's a nice parody argument and it's something for Trinitarians to be thinking through. And so it's like, this
sure.
is great. Guys, here's another one. Like think through this
Yeah,
too. It's
yeah,
it's really fun. Yeah.
yeah.
So I wanted to jump in now to the so some people are gonna be really interested in what we just talked about, and some are like, I'm just here for the idealism. Like, that's fine.
Okay,
Here we
okay.
go. So it's a Hasidic solution to the problem of
Of
Sefirot.
the Sefirot, yeah,
Yeah, yeah. And you say, hey, look, maybe God's dreaming. Can you help us out?
yeah.
Like, this is so good, man.
Yeah, well, and I'll be really controversial with you here, Parker.
Yeah.
I'll up the ante. I'm not sure whether the Sefirot exists, right? It's a
Sure.
theory of mystical Judaism. It's interesting. I'm interested in it. What could they possibly mean? I am quite committed to the idealism thing.
Whew.
And what I was trying to do in this paper that you're citing, maybe you can post a link on it to
Yeah.
it, or, but what I was trying to do in that paper was say, look, you could use the idealism that the Hasidic movement championed. You could actually use it to solve the problem with the Sefirot. Now, I don't personally have a horse in this race because I'm not tremendously committed to the Sefirot existing or to taking it literally. Maybe not. I don't know, but I like the idealism thing. So
Yeah.
I'll try and explain to you in a nutshell what the idealism thing is. I'm sorry that my emails keep
Oh, no worries. Yeah, can't even hear it.
pinging. So the way the idealism piece works is like this, and I actually wrote a paper with my partner in crime, Tyron Goldschmidt, with whom
Yeah.
I've written quite a few pieces, and we wrote a piece called "Divine Contractions: Theism Gives Birth to Idealism." It's open access; people can find it. It's on Religious Studies, the Cambridge University Press journal. So, Jewish mysticism, at least as it unfolds in the Hasidic tradition, as Tyron Goldschmidt and I understand it, is like idealism on steroids.
Yeah.
Okay. And I want to try and give your readers a sense of what would motivate this. Okay. Why should a theist adopt a really radical idealism?
Yeah.
And the basic picture goes something like this. Okay. We believe in God. Okay, this much we have in common, you and me, Parker, and I hope many of
Amen.
many of your listeners, right? We
Yep.
believe in God, and we think that God is perfect, and there may be a puzzle as to how can something perfect create a world like ours, and there are various ways into the puzzle. One way into the puzzle is that you could put it this way: God is so powerful that nothing He could create could, in some very important sense of the word, be beyond him, because he has such immediate power over over anything because of his
Yeah.
omnipotence. Tyron and I relate that power, that immediately efficacious power that God has. So right now, you have a fabulous moustache there, Parker. But right now,
Thank you.
if God wanted that to disappear, it would disappear immediately. He wouldn't
Yeah.
have to trouble himself with a razor. It would just disappear immediately.
Yeah.
Right? That kind of direct power from intention to result is the sort of power that characterizes the relationship between a mind and an idea of that mind,
Mm-hmm.
right? You don't have that power over many things, right? You can't just like intend and then, right?
Yeah.
But you do have that power over your ideas, right? You can, conjure a red flower in your head, and then you can say, I'm going to make it green, and then straight. You don't have to go out and buy any paint. It's just green immediately. It's green
Yeah.
immediately. One of the arguments that Goldschmidt and I put forward is that God, because he's all powerful, he couldn't create something so far removed from his power that his powers would be anything different to the power that minds tend to have over their ideas.
Yeah.
So to speak, from God's position, anything that God could possibly create would just be a mind in his an idea in his mind. Sorry.
Yeah.
Or another way into the idealism is to think that, well, God is absolutely and utterly perfect, but there is no such thing as a perfect world. Now, part of perfection is that you would never create something suboptimal.
Mm-hmm.
The perfect God wouldn't create something suboptimal, but there is no optimal world. So God's in a bind. It looks like he can't create. So I've made two binds for God. The first bind is he can't create anything outside his mind.
Mm-hmm.
The second bind is he can't create anything that's suboptimal, but there's nothing that's perfect apart from him.
Yeah.
So he can't create. And there are different solutions to the problem. And there's actually a third problem. I won't get into a third way of putting the problem. There are different solutions to this problem, but the Hasidic understanding of the Kabbalistic solution to this problem is that God actually didn't create a world. He didn't create a world that exists outside of his mind. Instead, he imagined creating a world, and that's the most a perfect God could do. And that act of imagining brings into reality something like a fiction. And, you and I, we live within this fiction.
Yeah.
Now, it's a crazy view, it's a wacky view.
Yeah.
You could come up with a million objections. I've tried to answer many of them in various places of my writings. But to really understand the view, and you know, I think this will give you the essence of it. You need to imagine reality as functioning all the time on two levels.
Hmm.
Okay, there's there is the world as it is from God's perspective, and there's the world as it is from our perspective.
Yeah.
And both of these are equally real in some sense of the word real, but one is obviously more fundamental. The world as it appears to God is more fundamental than the world as it appears
Yeah.
to us. But they're both real in some sense. And what you have to do is whenever you describe some phenomenon, you have to tell me whether you're describing it relative uh, to the world as it appears to us or relative to the world as it appears to God. And it's much like the distinction you have to make when talking about fictions in general.
Yeah.
So I could ask you, is Hamlet a Danish prince? Well, you have to clarify. Do you mean in the story? And then the answer is yes. Do you mean outside of the story? I don't know, in the world of the actual writer called Shakespeare? No, Hamlet wasn't a Danish prince.
Yeah.
Um, does Hamlet have free will? Well, in the story, yes, he does. But relative to Shakespeare, no, he doesn't.
Yeah.
Hamlet does whatever Shakespeare ordains for him to do. And finally, is Hamlet a figment in Shakespeare's imagination? Well, in the story, no, he's not. He's a real person of flesh and blood. But from Shakespeare's perspective, yes, he's just a figment of Shakespeare's imagination. And we could say exactly the same things, mutatis mutandis, about us and our perspective and God's perspective.
Yeah.
That's the idealism piece.
It's like I have so much to ask because I wrote my master's thesis on the God world relation as
Great.
as a authorial analogy, and so I'm like, oh,
Mm.
it's so good. There's so much. So, okay, so first and foremost, I want to
Was
anticipate.
C.S. Lewis your main go-to?
He was one of them, but I think the free will piece he didn't think through as much. So
Mm.
he thought of it more as a tool for looking at particular things like, well, why isn't God, how come the Russians can't go out into space and see God? Well, because he's not like that kind of thing. But then
Right. Yeah.
Kevin Van Hooser develops it for like everything, and I think that his
Yeah.
model, it commits you to certain things. And I wanted to ask you about the notion of free will at play and stuff, but I want to
Great.
anticipate an objection. So some people would say, well, look, let's go with perfect being theism and think
Mm.
through, an idealist God who can only create in his mind versus one who can create outside of his mind.
Yeah.
Seems like the one outside of his mind is more powerful. And what you guys are doing is actually, you and Tyron seem like a similar move that's done when you think about the paradox of the stone. And it's like, look, is
Yes.
God limited? No, no, no. He's limited by his
His
omnipotence. Sure.
perfection.
Yeah.
Right.
Right.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah. And so
So
I
it's
think
a
it's the same move, right? It's
Yeah, that's exactly right. It's what we're saying is it's a consequence of his perfection that he
yeah.
can't create a world that's distinct from him or outside of him.
Yeah.
And actually, if you describe a God who can, you're describing a less perfect God.
Right.
It sounds paradoxical, but
Yeah.
we think, on careful scrutiny, that's actually how things unfold.
Yeah. And it's similar to like George Mavrode's, I think that's how you say it. He has
Yeah,
this
I always
he
call it Mavrodes, but I think you're right. It's
yeah.
Mavrodes. Yeah,
Yeah, yeah, I have no idea. But he says, look, it looks like under like careful scrutiny, it comes out to being like, hey, can God, make a dog that's too big for a God who's perfectly capable of walking dogs? Can he do that? Well, no, he can't do that because you're asking him to be limited. So, like, what you guys
yeah,
are saying is, when you spell it out, you're asking God to be less than perfect. You're asking him to be less than
exactly,
omnipotent. And
exactly.
so, it's a really careful argument that if you want to critique it, you gotta do the hard work of finding out exactly what's going on here.
That's right.
Yeah,
That's right.
yeah,
Now, I think better critiques, and you've anticipated these in your comments, is yeah, but on this view, we wouldn't have free will,
yeah,
and
yeah,
surely we have that. We
yeah,
know we have
yeah,
that, and
yeah,
and the problem of evil, you might think,
yeah.
becomes
Of course.
exacerbated.
Sure.
right?
Can I, before we go there, can I ask about? I want
Sure.
to ask about the perfect world type stuff. So probably planning us, maybe someone else, but there's like this objection to God creating a perfect world, and the objection is something like there is no perfect world because you could always
Yeah.
add one more thing. And so you guys
One
might
more
use that
fluffy bunny.
exactly right. They always planning always says hula girls, dancing hula girls. I'm like that
Dancing hula
might be a
girls.
little yeah, a little inappropriate.
It's a bit yeah, that's a bit passé, right? You could
Nowadays,
get
yeah.
away talking that
Right.
way, but it's
That's
not
right. That's
appropriate.
right. Yeah, yeah, dancing bunnies or whatever you said. Um,
Yeah, yeah,
and you guys might use that to say, look, because that's the case, there is no perfect world, or not might. This is what you guys say. There's no perfect
yeah.
world, so therefore a perfect being couldn't create because otherwise he's creating less than. What if
That's
following your own like narrative theme or like the theodramatic theme from Van Hooser
yeah,
or whatever we go with. What if what if he is not what if he's not going for like the perfect world in balance of evil and good, but the perfect narrative, the perfect story.
yeah,
Right?
yeah.
What if that's like
Yes.
the impetus for creating a world outside of himself? What do you make of that one?
Good, good. So I like that, and I think that's actually part of the explanation. Is one of the classic theological questions is why does God create a world at all?
Yeah.
And it's actually on this view, it's a function of his kind of narrative brilliance, his artistic
Yeah.
brilliance. It's an
Right.
aesthetic thing, right?
Yeah.
Why does a storyteller tell a story?
Yeah.
Um, now, so I like that, but I'd say this. Um, um, I tried to explain that there are multiple problems, right? There's the problem of creating an optimal world. There's also problems to do with God's power. There's also problems to do with God's rationality.
Yeah.
I won't get into it here, but we develop a similar problem from God's rationality. So I'd say, well, look, yeah, you might be right that God would have a reason to create a less than perfect world for kind of narratival purposes, but it might be that one of our other arguments will kick in and say,
Okay.
yeah, but still, that world can't be outside of him.
Yeah.
It could at most be a story with, so to speak, within his mind.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah.
Okay. That's really good. So, I want to talk about evil real quick, and then we can go into like the free will stuff too. But does
And we
this?
must eventually explain how this idealism could potentially solve the problem with the Sefirot, right?
Yes.
Because
Yes.
we
Yes.
spent
Yeah.
a lot of time
Yeah.
setting it up.
Yeah. That's right. That's right. It's a good point. Thank you. I'm so excited about it. I'm having a hard time even like focusing. So, would this commit you to like a privationist view of evil because all evil then would exist in God, who is a perfect being?
Well, I actually think when it gets to the problem of evil, this view has to offer two responses to the problem of evil.
Okay.
It has to respond from the point of view of God, the author,
Uh huh.
right? Why does God, so to speak, is telling a story, tell a story in which all these terrible, horrible things happen?
Hmm.
But actually, from God's perspective, that's not so pressing
Yeah.
because from God's perspective, they're figments of his imagination, right? From
Oh, yeah.
God's perspective, the pain and suffering isn't real. There's still a question to ask. Why can't you tell a nicer story, God? Like, it's pretty horrible, some of these things you're imagining. So
Right.
it's still a problem, but that's one problem and it needs its own response. But uh, we traditional theists, I won't say classical theists, but we theists in the Abrahamic traditions, we don't just believe that God is an author of the story; He's also a character in it.
Right.
And you don't need the Christian incarnation to believe that, because even even for Christians before the coming
Yeah.
of Jesus, God split the sea,
Right.
God
Pillar
freed the
pillar
Jews
of
from
smoke. He's
Egypt,
speaking out of
pillar of smoke,
bushes.
all
Yeah.
that stuff.
Amen.
Exactly,
Yeah.
right? So God appears in the story. Now that happens in novels too. Novelists appear in their stories.
Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
But the thing is, um, what's true of the novelist and what's true as the novelist as a character in the story might be different,
Yeah.
right? So, for
Yeah.
instance, Kurt Vonnegut appears in The Breakfast of Champions,
Hmm.
and in The Breakfast of Champions, it's true to say that he visited Kilgore Trout. That's
Yeah.
true in the story,
Hmm.
but it's not true outside of the story because there's no such person as Kilgore Trout.
Yeah.
Kilgore Trout is just a figment of Vonnegut's imagination. So too, we can talk about what's true of God in the story that he tells and what's true of God fundamentally, or
Yeah.
from God's perspective. Now, in the story that God tells, God created the world, made us, and lets us suffer. So God as a character in the story owes us a theodicy. Why does the character called God do that? Right.
Yeah.
Now, I actually think any of the classical theodicies um, could be adopted here. You could
Yeah.
give a free will defense. You could give a soul making defense. You could give any of them. So it's kind of interesting. It's on the level of God, the author, he's going to tell you one thing, and on the level of God, the character in the story, he'll tell you another.
Yeah.
If you go on to be super radical, you could say, well, actually, God as he appears in the story is not completely perfect. His complete and utter perfection is hidden from us in the story, and then the problem of evil disappears.
Hmm.
Right? I mean, that's very radical, and
Yeah.
I don't
Yeah.
want to be branded a heretic by my co-religionists,
Right.
but you could go that way. God
Yeah.
is perfect beyond the story.
Yeah.
He says to Moses in that chapter in Exodus, no man can see my goodness and live.
Hmm.
Kol to thee, my entire goodness. It's almost like in order to give room for a world to exist, when God reveals himself to us as a character in the story, he doesn't reveal himself as a completely and utterly perfect character.
Yeah.
His perfection is at the transcendent level.
Yeah.
So that's evil.
Well, oh,
Done.
yeah, that's right. Everyone's done. No more. I just love this analogy so much because in the Christian tradition, I studied theology and I'm studying philosophy, and
Yeah.
they're fighting in my own head, but they're also my friends, and they come on the podcast and they fight too. And
Good.
this analogy, at least from the authorial model, and it works the same with Hasidic idealism.
Hmm.
Is God timeless or is he temporal? Well, which one are you talking about? Because the author stands
Exactly.
outside of the story, and yet he's a character
Yeah.
in the story. And I'm an evangelical, so I have to use C.S. Lewis for this
Mm.
stuff. But
Yeah.
You think of the Great Divorce. Lewis is a
Yeah.
character in the story, and yet he's
Yeah.
talking with his characters. But meanwhile, Lewis is holding the whole story together in his mind.
In his head.
And
Yeah. That's
insofar
absolutely right.
Yeah, and insofar as the
Yeah.
author, writes his own character, himself as a character in a way
Yeah.
that, genuinely represents him, then, yeah, you
Yeah.
can trust that, like, C.S. Lewis is like this in
That's right.
base reality or, in and
That's
of
right.
himself.
Right.
And
Like that it's
yeah,
not deceptive.
yeah,
It's not deceptive, but as sophisticated readers of fiction, we might recognize that, oh, in order to function as a character in this story, he had to become temporal or something.
right,
Whereas perhaps in the transcendent space, he's atemporal.
yeah,
I tried doggedly not to have a view on that about whether
yeah.
God outside of the story is temporal or atemporal.
Well,
But
and
in the
and
story,
it could be
he
either,
certainly seems
right?
temporal.
Yeah, it
He could
could
be
be either.
either.
You
Yeah.
don't know, but you think about
Yeah.
C.S. Lewis writing the story, and the climax of the story is about to happen, and then pause. What's going on? Where's the climax? It's
Yeah.
like, oh, Lewis had to
I'm
go
sorry,
get
I'm going for tea.
yeah, to
Yeah.
get coffee. Yeah, and it's like, no, it doesn't actually pause because there's two different levels of time going on.
Exactly.
Whether the God level actually has time or not, it's still
Yeah.
different. It's still a different time.
Exactly.
That's so
Exactly.
good. Yeah. Well, I think
Yeah.
about
No, it's a very powerful model.
yeah,
Yeah.
and it can bring a lot of people together, and a lot of people will say you're heretics. So that's
Yes.
maybe you're onto something when that stuff happens.
Right.
Um, I'm wondering, okay, here's a difference though. So, yes, you need a theodicy, and I think if God's telling a story in his mind, or if he's telling a story up, out there in the world, he would have a greater if he's good, he would have a morally sufficient reason for writing the evil into the story. Cool, that's all cool. I think one thing that I want to hear from you on is if the story is outside of himself in an objective world, going on, uh, yeah, in creation, then like evil is out here. It's out here
Mm,
in the story. But if it's all in
mm.
God's mind, then it seems like this perfect being has evil like in his head, unless we go with
He
like a
can at
privationist.
least, yeah, at least he can imagine evil,
Yeah. Oh,
right?
okay.
So then you have a question, and I hate to use this terminology on your respectable podcast, but it wasn't my terminology. It's
Okay.
actually entered the learned canon. It's called, I almost can't bear to say it myself, but it's called the horny God objection, right?
Yeah. Did
You've
Mullins
heard
make
about
that up?
this?
Did Mullins make that up, or was it someone else?
No, no. If I'm not, well, I think Mullins made it up, but I think he was actually riffing on the PhD dissertation of Tasia Scruton at
Okay.
Leeds.
Okay.
I'm not sure, but I think Anastasia Scruton is the real source of this
Okay. Okay.
horny God objection.
Yeah.
The idea is some people think that related to what you were saying with Mavrodes and the rock that God can't pick up. There are certain paradoxes of God's perfection. Some people think that it's a function of God's perfection. There are certain things he couldn't imagine,
Right.
right? So he couldn't imagine evil things. He couldn't, and he couldn't have like horny thoughts. Is
Yeah.
is the reason it's given that.
Yeah.
It's not like if God sees an attractive person, I won't say male or female, but God sees an attractive person enter a room, he doesn't go, oh, that's
Right.
just not,
Right.
it doesn't, and it couldn't enter God's mind to think such a
Right.
thing.
Right.
So I I actually think I'm committed to the view, because otherwise I don't think I could explain at all evil in the world. I'm committed to the view that God can imagine evil things.
Yeah.
I don't think I need to take a stance on whether evil is just a privation or
Okay.
I just don't think it's part of perfection not to be able to imagine bad things. On the
Yeah.
contrary, I think we're talking about artistic perfection as well and aesthetic perfection. I think there are some people in aesthetics who want to condemn artists and authors for their ability to imagine very dark things.
Right.
I don't think that's fair. I actually think it's part of their aesthetic perfection that they can imagine those things,
Hmm.
perhaps even that they can see the beauty in them.
Yeah. Well, okay, I've been thinking about this one a lot because of the authorial analogy, but it seems like there might be
Mm,
some kind of like aesthetic or ethical requirement. If you wrote a story that's only about like graphic child abuse and there's no redemptive qualities, you'd be like, "Hey, man, this is really bad. You shouldn't write
yeah,
this," you know?
yeah, yeah.
But
So I
that's
think
not the case here, right?
exactly. I
Yeah.
think I would agree to that, Parker.
Yeah.
God couldn't write a bad story, and whatever
Yeah.
bad story means, right?
Right.
And I agree with you. A story that was just unrelentingly evil, and there didn't seem to be any point.
Yeah.
That's something we can't believe God, even
Yeah.
in his transcendence, would be able to do.
Yeah.
But I do think God could imagine a world with holocausts and terrible, terrible things, so long as like Martin Luther King Jr. said, the arc of the moral universe is long, but it bends towards justice. If
Yeah.
if if the story as a whole, ends in redemption, then I don't see why God shouldn't be able to imagine
Totally.
even the most dire things.
Yeah. So,
Yeah,
I love this. I love this topic. I shouldn't say it's hard to say I love this topic, but it touches so much stuff in philosophy of religion, like
sure,
Zagzebski's omnisubjectivity. Like, does God
sure,
have our perspective? Well, what if I'm doing
yeah,
something evil? Okay, so that touches that, and
yeah,
then Graham
yeah,
Oppy calls it like the problem of body thoughts, which is a little bit outdated term for a lot of us millennials and Gen
yeah,
Zers, but it's a problem
yeah,
of body thoughts for theistic conceptual realism. um,
yeah,
and it's like, okay, all this stuff's connected. This is on the table for all of us. So it's really fun
yeah.
thinking through this.
Here's like a really weird question, right? But something I've thought about. There are certain experiences we can't really imagine having because we don't have the right sorts of bodies, right?
Yeah.
So as a cis male, I can't really imagine giving birth, right? I can
Mm.
imagine being in pain. I can imagine but like certainly not with much authority, right? I can't imagine
Yeah.
it. So, but here's the thing, right? Tolstoy writes Anna Karenina, the novel, and it's a female protagonist.
Yeah.
Is there anything that Anna Karenina knows what it feels like that Tolstoy doesn't know what it feels like?
Yeah. Right.
Well, like, how could there be?
Right.
Because like everything that Anna Karenina it's all imagined by Tolstoy.
Yeah.
So I think it gives you a way to understand omnisubjectivity,
Yeah.
even though God is so transcendent and other and doesn't have a body, and
Right.
having bodies themselves was just an idea that God
I
had.
know. I
So
know.
like,
Yeah. Yeah. Like, yeah. And you might, if you're like really analytic into it, you might go with like conditional or something. God knows what it would be like. So it's like, does God know what
you're
it's
like,
like to eat a Chicago style hot dog? It's like, well, what do you mean?
yeah,
Like, does he know what it's like for me? Yeah. What does he know what it
yeah,
would be like if he were to incarnate? Yeah, he does. Of
yeah,
course. But
but he doesn't know what it's like to eat one without having a body because there's no
right.
such thing as that, right?
Right,
Yeah,
right. But I think it's a helpful clarification because then it's not just like God's spirit, he can't do that. It's like, well, we can say
no,
more than that. We can absolutely say more than
ex-
that, but Yeah.
exactly.
I have to.
Yeah,
So
but when you understand that God created the concept of taste,
and hot
and God
dogs.
created the concept, yeah, and hot dogs, right? So,
Yeah. Maybe
of
I
course,
should
He knows
use
what they taste
yeah
like.
kosher ones. It would
The
have to be
kosher one, the
yeah
kosher ones.
exactly. Um, I have to say because if Dr. Van Hooser is listening, his whole point in his authorial analogy is that God would have to be like a Dostoevsky instead of a Tolstoy because he would say
Mm,
like depending on literary criticism or whatever, like Tolstoy
yeah,
is kind of right there wearing a mask behind his characters, whereas Dostoevsky's almost like come to life on their own, and they don't always
yeah,
represent the ideas of the character of the author
yeah,
himself. So that's just
yeah,
a different point about. But I think there's something here with imagining. Okay, so this brings us on to free will.
yeah,
I would think that this would commit us to a form of compatibilism, but maybe not. Maybe not. And I've heard like maybe Molinism and maybe like a libertarian free will. I know like Hugh McCann in Creation and Sovereignty of God is kind of like
yeah,
a leeway compatibilist about stuff like this. So have you? What do you think? Is it
yeah.
broad enough, or is it
So,
committed just to
so I
compatibilism?
wrote a paper years back. It's got many imperfections in, and I think the best parts of it exist in my book now called The Principles of Judaism. But in that paper, it's called God and His Imaginary Friends, a
Yeah,
Hasidic
I love this
metaphysics,
one. I
right?
really like this one. Yeah.
Thank you, Parker. So I cite Hugh McCann there in a few places
Oh,
in
I
that
didn't catch that.
paper,
Okay.
and no, it's only in the footnotes, but I think it's only in the footnotes. But I I relate to the issue of free will over there, and the model I put forward there is like libertarianism uh, is how is God imagines us into existence with our libertarian free will.
Yeah.
And so you get this again. You need to analyze our statements relative to one or other of the levels of this ontology I'm giving you that I'm calling
Mm.
Hasidic idealism. From God's perspective, it's true that everything we do is preordained, right? So that's like at best a compatibilist free will we have,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah. Yeah.
But but you're misreading the story of Hamlet if you keep saying, "Oh, why did Hamlet do that?" Oh, because Shakespeare wanted him to. No,
Yeah. Right. Right.
that's not part of the story. Hamlet, Shakespeare dreams Hamlet up as freely choosing to do things, and it might well be that libertarianism is part of what we really mean by freedom, in a thick sense of freedom.
Yeah.
So, and that I take very much from Hugh McCann. Hugh
Yeah.
McCann says that pretty much explicitly.
Right.
The author, he uses the authorial analogy there, and he says an author imagines a character freely choosing, and it's
Yeah.
the act of the author's imagine. Now, it's really hard for people to get their head around. You could almost call it like it's meta compatibilism because it's trying to make libertarianism compatible
Right. Right.
with uh, with with a type of theological fatalism.
Yeah. So I read Hugh McCann's book. It's for the audience, Creation and the Sovereignty of God. And I read it for my
Yeah,
master's thesis because I saw that he
yeah,
was using that. And it was
yeah.
so I just dropped it because I was like, look, I can't do this with the libertarianism. Maybe someone else can, and it looks like you have. But I was thinking like, well, it's just easier to use like reasons responsiveness or something like
Yeah,
God.
I'm cool with that.
Yeah,
I hate to break it to myself because my younger self would hate this,
yeah.
but I'm less and less committed to libertarianism.
Okay. Yeah.
I used to
And
think it was super important, and
well, it works
there are
super
other
well.
options.
Yeah, and the other options work super well with the dream analogy or with the authorial narrative analogy because at one level, why did Gollum Smeagol become Gollum? Well, because
Yeah,
it was integral to the plot
to
and
the plot, it couldn't
yeah,
have happened any other way,
and
right?
Tolkien wrote that and he wrote it from his office and
Yeah, it
if
would
it
have been a
didn't
different
have
story.
it wouldn't have
It
been
would have
as
been a
good of a
completely
story. Yeah,
no, no,
right.
yeah,
But then you look intra-narratively and you're like, "Why did he do it?" Well, because he was jealous and he had his
that's
own reasons that he was drawn to and he didn't feel Tolkien like if Tolkien, ex machina'd him and made him, like, totally different, like, dropped in out of nowhere, he's a bad author,
yeah,
and the story
yeah,
falls apart.
absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Okay.
So what I tried to do in that paper was to say, even libertarianism
Yeah.
can kind of be salvaged, but I'm not as committed to the
Yeah.
necessity of doing that anymore.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Brian Ballard came on my show, and we were talking about this because he's working on, like, narrative realism, and,
Mm.
he was saying maybe it's like a choose your own adventure story where
Yes,
right, where it's like kind of like Molinism, and there's a bunch of options, and so God wouldn't ever let it the libertarianism run amok and make it a bad story. He couldn't do that, but he's given all these different options,
yeah,
and so you
yeah.
can choose how the story goes, perhaps.
Some in some places I called that weak Hasidic idealism,
Ah,
is
nice.
the idea that somehow God has created the world with figments of his imagination, but somehow, because God is so much more powerful than any author we can imagine, um, his merely fictional creatures are actually agents,
Yeah.
and therefore they get to make choices or whatever. But I'm into the extreme Hasidic idealism, which is
Yes.
what I think the Hasidic tradition, which is that actually no, like we are agents. Of course, we're agents in the story,
Yes.
right?
Yes.
But from God's perspective, it doesn't make sense to say that we could have made it go differently,
Right.
right? You know. Um, yeah, there's
Yep.
lots more problems here, and I think a
Yeah.
lot
Yeah.
of your listeners will be like, "Why didn't Barker ask this problem or this
Yeah.
problem?" Because
Yeah. Yeah.
there's only so much you can discuss in a certain
Right.
time. But I would, if people are interested, like you said, all these authors you've cited deal with the authorial analogy. It looks like
Yeah.
you have in your own work,
Yeah.
and in my Principles of Judaism, the book is in three parts, and in the first part of the Principles of Judaism, I really try to grapple with many of the problems your audience might have raised without
Yeah. Yeah.
without us getting to. So
Yeah. There's just a couple. Do you have a little bit more time? I can
yeah, we
hit.
have to solve the problem of
That's right.
Sefirot.
That's right. That's right. Um, real quick before we do that, I know. Okay, there's two things. One is just does this commit us to like pluralist? Are we pluralists about being like? Are we
Great question,
Meinongians
Parker.
here? Yeah.
Great question, Parker. I don't think it makes us Monongians,
Okay.
but I'm actually working on a paper with the brilliant Filippo Cassato. He's a philosopher at Lehigh,
Okay.
um, and he's tried to push me to recognize, and I think he's right, that Hasidic idealism cannot solve many of its own problems without a view called ontological pluralism, which
Yeah.
is what you're pointing to. Ontological pluralism doesn't have to be confused with Monongianism, because
Okay.
that's one particular type of ontological pluralism, right?
Yeah.
Um, Meinong thought that not everything that has being exists, so he thought there were kind of different species of existence. I think that what what the Hasidic idealists might have to say is there are degrees of being,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And that God has a higher degree of being than anything else, right? God, the
Yeah.
author, has a higher degree of being than anything else. There are various reasons why I don't want to say that it's Meinongian, but they're technical.
Yeah.
I agree with you. I
Okay.
think it will be hard to make sense of this view, but you being quicker than me, I didn't see that until recently. I've published a lot on this topic, and I didn't really get into issues of ontological
Yeah.
pluralism.
Well, this is so cool, and I think for like the hardcore Thomists out there who hold to like the Analogia Entis or something, it's similar to that. It doesn't have to be like some crazy Meinongianism. And, oh no, and whatever. Even if it is, then just defend it. Who cares? But
Yeah,
Joshua,
that's right. That's
right?
right.
Just stand behind it. But Joshua Sijuade has been doing some of this with existential quantifiers and using different ones, and he's pulling in.
Yeah.
So I need to get all you guys together, and we need to like work on.
Most
Yeah, it's
most
so good.
Thomists accept, and I think most scholastic medieval theologians from across the three Abrahamic traditions accept that there's a sense in which God's existence is different to ours,
Yeah.
right?
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
and and that's part of the problem that people would say to me when I first put this stuff forward. They want to say something like, "What are you saying? That like me and my freedom aren't real?" I'm
Yeah.
like, no, you are real. You're as real as anything else in your environment. The only thing you're not as real as is God. And if you've got
Right.
a problem with that, then that's that.
Right.
We shouldn't. It's impious to think that we deserve to be on the same ontological level as God,
Right.
right?
Right. Right.
You're
Totally.
as real as anything else,
Yeah. All right.
except for
Last one
God.
before we get back to
Yeah,
Sphira.
yeah,
Uh, Panentheism. Is this a
yeah,
form of panentheism? So where the world is in God, but God is more than the world.
yeah.
The world's in the
It
mind of
might
God.
be.
Okay.
It might be. It just depends how you define that term.
Just especially
So
tricky to demarcate, right?
exactly,
Yeah.
and I think part of the problem is that I don't think of ideas as being parts in a Mariological sense. I don't think of ideas as being parts of the minds that think them.
Yeah.
Some philosophers of mind do think that,
Right.
right? So,
Yeah.
some philosophers of mind would say that every idea I have is a part of my mind.
Yeah.
I'm not attracted to that view,
Yeah.
and the ontology I'm providing suggests that the world is to God what ideas are to minds.
Yes.
And therefore, I'm not saying that the world is part of God. And I take it that Orthodox panentheism is the assertion that the world is part of God. Well, then, no, I'm not a
Yeah.
panentheist.
Yeah. Yeah.
But if you're taking it with a pinch of salt, you're saying no, it's a metaphor, it's part of God in some sense. I get why you might think you might want to call this it's panentheistic in spirit.
Yes, yes, that's a good way to put it. And it especially if you go in for like Brian Leftow's view on like abstract objects and God, where he's like a theistic
Yeah.
conceptual nominalist, then these are
Yes.
God's thoughts, but they're all like a current, and he does it in a way where they're not like their own entities inside God's mind, and so you can still be like hold to simplicity. And that's so
Yeah.
fascinating. Again, it's all connected. So for those who are thinking this is just
Yes.
like stoner thoughts, it's like, well, sure, maybe,
No,
but
no,
it's
no.
also philosophy of religion, like deep stuff.
What
Yeah.
I'm trying, well, in fact, what I really want to do, I love what you said. Like, so it might not be my Monongian, and if it is, so defend it. I
Yeah.
love that attitude, Parker, because I
Yeah.
think that the job of theistic philosophers, we're all theists, perhaps for slightly different reasons, our own life experience, our own, whichever our favorite arguments might be for
Right.
theism. We're all, we've come to theism. I think the responsible thing for theistic philosophers to do is say, okay, what are the consequences of this?
Mm.
And don't imagine that they won't be radical, because it's a radical thought,
Yeah.
right? That
Yeah.
there is a supreme being and that everything else that exists in virtue of that
Mm.
being's activity or intentions, or you know it, we you any good theist will end up sounding like a stoner because
That's right. That's
it's a
right.
kind of a crazy
Well,
view.
doesn't that just breathe the fire back into your faith too, though? It's like
Oh,
God,
yeah,
some for whatever reason, God gets boring. And it's like, well, what? No, God is not boring. God is the most exciting thing you could ever think about.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly,
Yeah.
exactly.
Well, let's go back and see if we can solve this problem of Sefirot. How does
I'll do it for you in a second.
Sefirot? Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. I'll try and
Yeah.
do it for you really quickly, right? So we've already got all the ingredients here, and the basic idea is something like this. Um, we said what's true of the author outside of the story and what's true of the author in the story can actually be different, even though they are numerically the same author, right?
Yeah.
So
Yeah.
the words Kurt Vonnegut refer to one person. There's no two Kurt Vonnegut's, there's one Kurt Vonnegut. But what's true of him in The Breakfast of Champions isn't identical to what's true of him outside of The Breakfast of Champions, even though there's only one of them.
Yeah.
So I want you to be able to imagine a strange story in which the author appears as more than one character, or one person, one real person appears as more than one character in a story.
It's like David
The
Hume's
example,
dialogues, right?
yeah, well, that's a good example. But which one's Hume? Well, multiple
Yeah.
protagonists are Hume, but here's an example I give people. I call it the story. It's a story called Loving Lois. Okay,
Mm.
what I want you to do is you imagine that Lois Lane writes a story that's about Clark Kent and Superman,
Yeah.
but she doesn't know that they are the same person.
Mhm.
Okay, now it's about Clark Kent and it's about Superman. She doesn't know that they're the same person. And in the story, they fight over her. Superman throws Clark Kent out of a window. Clark Kent, goes and gets some kryptonite and tries to, poison Superman because they're
Yeah.
both madly in love with Lois Lane. It's her nighttime story writing, fantasy writing. It seems to me that the right analysis of such a story is that in the story, Clark Kent and Superman are two people.
Yeah.
You would be misunderstanding the story if you thought they were one person, because one person can't hold them, can't throw the other one out of the window, right?
Right.
In the story, they are two people, and yet, because unbeknownst to Lois, in the real world, Clark Kent and Superman are the same person,
Mhm.
and because unbeknownst to Lois, one of her characters is Clark Kent and one of her characters is Superman, but they're actually the same person.
Yeah.
I want to say that you get these really weird consequences. The consequence would be Clark Kent is identical to Superman outside of the story
Hmm.
and non-identical inside the story. How many people are there?
Yeah.
How many people are there? Well, there are two,
Yeah.
Superman and Clark Kent in the story, and there's one, Superman who is
Yeah.
Clark Kent outside of the story. And I
Yeah.
wanted to imagine that even an author could do that too. An author could put themselves in a story as more than one person.
Yeah.
And the suggestion is that if you're committed for one reason or another to the Kabbalistic tradition, and you really believe there are these 10 Sefirot and they really do interact in the ways that the Kabbalah says that they do, you could say, well, perhaps, we're all characters in God's story, but these 10 are special because these 10 are God appearing as 10 characters.
Yeah.
And then it will be that in the story, they are non identical, but outside of the story, they're all one.
Yeah.
And it's no more of a paradox than the loving Lois scenario. Um, and I like it. I think, if you do have reason to believe in the Sefirot, you can actually salvage almost everything the mystics say about the Sefirot now. Oh, they're 10 and they're one. You just have to be careful which level of reality they're
Yeah.
speaking about, and you can get everything out you wanted to get out. And I wanted in the paper to suggest that maybe a Trinitarian could do the same thing.
Yeah.
Now, my friend and colleague, and he was my office mate for the year at Notre Dame, Cole Mosier, who's a really
Yeah.
decent Protestant, theologian,
Great
great
guy.
guy, evangelical as well, I think,
Mhm.
and a really fabulous human being. He was like, no, this can't work for the Trinitarian because he wants to say that it's of the essence of Trinitarianism that God is essentially triune.
Yeah.
So that would mean that somehow God, the author, has to be triune as well.
Yeah.
But I wanted to say, well, look, you could even go like this. You could even say, like, in the story, God is essentially triune,
Yeah.
or something like that.
Yeah.
I would say that beyond the story, he's undifferentiated. But look, it's not my
Yeah.
trying to save Trinitarianism is not my that's not my issue.
Yeah.
I just wanted to offer it to my Christian friends. I do think it works for the Sefirot.
Yeah.
I think it might work for Eastern Orthodoxy in their talk of these divine energies.
Yeah.
Whether or not it works for the Trinity will be up to the Trinitarians to decide.
Yeah, and it might just take some tweaking of saying like, yeah, it's God is a function. God is a functional person made up of three intrinsicist persons. Chad McIntosh has done stuff like this, but I just want to make a point for the audience that we've gone all over the place, and we talked about
Yeah.
Mainonism, and now we're into Frege puzzles and hooded man
Yes.
cases.
Yes.
And
Exactly.
just for those who like poo-poo philosophy of religion, like philosophy of religion is philosophy on hard mode, because we also have
Yes.
traditions that we're trying to hold to and not
And to be
be
respectful of.
to be a respectful of
Yeah.
others, to not be smoked by God, maybe too. Like
Yes.
it's
Yes.
philosophy
Yeah.
on hard mode. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. This is where philosophy, in my mind, is most alive.
Yes. Yes. Okay. I got one more.
Sure.
This is for like the public facing philosophy. I always try to like,
Okay.
I actually hate that phrase, because what in my mind, a lot of public facing philosophy is just, I have this really technical stuff. How do I, foist it onto the audience? I really think it should be
Yeah.
like you take the questions that the popular audience has, the abstract thinkers who aren't philosophers, and you pull that in and you incorporate your work. So with that in mind,
Yeah.
I wanted to ask about simulation hypothesis and
Yeah.
how this might relate and how it might be different than,
Good.
is it just the same thing? Is that a metaphor for this
I,
dream?
I think they're deeply, deeply similar. I
Okay.
have a paper. It's currently under review. Let's hope it gets published one day. Called "We Live in a Story,"
Yeah.
and I tried to argue that. In a nutshell, what Nick Bostrom argues for in his famous simulation paper is that there's a good chance that we live in a simulation.
Right.
That's what he tries to argue, right?
Yeah.
In interviews, he sometimes says it's 20%. How
Yeah.
you
He
figure
comes
that
up.
out
Yeah.
exactly,
Right.
right? Well, I have this argument where I try to prove that, if there's a chance that we live in a simulation, then there's a much, much higher chance that we live in a story.
Yes.
And my idea is that stories are kind of a wider category than simulations,
Yeah.
but that simulations are kind of stories, like a limited type of a story, and that stories are a wider, and therefore it's overwhelmingly likely. I want to say that if it's 20% likely we're in a simulation, I want to argue it's overwhelmingly likely that we live in a story,
Yeah.
which just so happens to be a consequence of theism anyway.
Yes.
So,
Yes.
so
Yeah.
we shouldn't be surprised.
I love that so much, and I think even some theists will use the simulation hypothesis as a metaphor for God, and I'm like, hey, that's something, but the authorial analogy is much better because it actually has more
I
implications. It's got more explanatory power. We got a necessary
agree.
being instead of just some simulator, and I also think
I agree.
that the simulation hypothesis focuses so much on the furniture of the story. At the popular
Yeah,
level, they'll talk about physics and rendering and
yeah,
computer games. It's like that's so like base level. Like the narrative arc of the story is much more. That's who cares about the
yeah,
furniture on stage.
yeah.
Let's look at the characters and the plot.
Yeah, I'm totally with you.
This is
Yeah,
awesome.
and actually, God isn't limited by any of the things that might limit computational power of physical computers as
Yeah,
well, right?
yeah,
So
yeah.
the base reality has certain limitations potentially, but God has none,
Right.
right?
Right. Yeah. There's we can't talk about everything in the world, but maybe we got to get you back on. But for the audience, like some people will be reminded of Descartes' dream argument and say, well, that's a skeptical thesis. So maybe this
Yes.
isn't a skeptical thesis. And
No, 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 no. I think that's an important point to make, Parker. Yeah.
yeah, another one would be like, hey, look, yeah, sure, Tolkien's not on the hook for what Smeagol does, or Gollum does in the books, but
Yeah.
that's because they actually don't have a subjective perspective, whereas we do, and so God's still on the hook for evil here. And it's like,
Exactly. Yes, exactly.
yeah,
Especially God, the character in the story, he is on the hook, right?
yeah,
And that's why theodicy is an important project.
yeah,
And
yeah,
also, you're on the hook because
mm,
in the story in which you live, you're the one who's made the decisions you've made, and therefore
right,
you're on the hook.
right,
So so yeah, a lot more to talk about,
yes, yeah,
but I love your enthusiasm, Parker, and I hope that we've been able to spread some of that to your
yes, I
listeners
think
and
so.
your watchers.
Yeah, Sam, thanks so much for coming on to talk about your work. Thanks for the papers; they're amazing. I'm going to leave a link to your page with all your papers, and then I'll
Sure.
specifically put some of those in there. And
Thank
looking
you.
forward to having you back on soon.
Me too, Parker. This has
Yeah,
been a lot of fun. Thank you
yeah.
very much.
All right, folks,
Okay.
that's going to have to do it for now. This has been Parker's Pensées, and as always, all glory to God.